Okay, this video is going to be the next in our Chapter 2 Excel homework series, and it's going to be problem number 5. So this one's a little more detailed. We got a pretty quick problem for number 4, and this is kind of the opposite of that. So a decent amount of work to do, but we'll get through it, and this is kind of the heart and the meat and potatoes of Chapter 2. Okay, so we've got this manufacturing company, and we account for jobs using job order costing. On April 1st, there is a $4,200 balance in work in process. This consists of two jobs, job 534 with beginning balance 2,500 and 535, beginning balance of 1,700. So we can see here, there's a 4,200 balance. That's what we see here. So this will be a summary of all the job cost sheets, and beginning work in process here is 4,200, which agrees to what they told us above, and that's job 534 and 535, and that's just the beginning balances. Okay, so that's where we see it below. The company applies overhead using the predetermined overhead rate of 80% as a percentage of direct labor costs. So that's our predetermined overhead rate. So it'll be 0.8 times whatever it is, or 80% times direct labor costs. Okay, and then during the month of April, now what did we do here? We have 534 and 535. Those jobs were around at the beginning of the month. And 534, this one is still in process at the end of April. 535 is completed and not sold. And 536 is still in process as well. So what we should expect to see when we finish is both of 534 and 536 will be in work in process still, and 535 will be finished goods. But it's not sold yet, so we're not going to record the sales revenue and stuff associated with that. Okay, so then that's information that's handy. And then here it says the company noted the below costs for materials and labor. So we have job 534, 535, and 536. And as far as direct costs for materials, that's these here. And then there was some indirect materials that were used, $800 worth. Again, that could be things like WD-40 or glue or string for packaging or something, some small kind of indirect materials. And then our labor, you can see 534 had $1,900, 535, $3,000 of labor. And then we had some indirect labor also of $1,200. So those are the two indirect amounts here for materials and for labor. Okay, so now we've got our job cost sheets here, 534, 535, 536, and then just a summary of all of them together so we can see the totals, which is kind of handy. And so what we have to do in step 1 is to complete the job cost sheets above. And we've just got links in here, so it says note that the summary sheet will automatically update once you input amounts to the individual jobs. Okay, so the main thing we need to do is to assign or allocate these costs out to the specific jobs here. And so let's start with 534. And so direct materials and the cost incurred for that, we go up here and say, okay, it had 2,300 indirect materials. And then direct labor is the next line. So job 534 had direct labor here of 1,900. And then the way that we just allocate our overhead, as it told us previously, was 80% of direct labor costs. So we can just do a formula to say take direct labor costs times 0.8, which is 80%. Or we could write it out if you feel more comfortable doing that, times 80%. And that gives you 1,520 of assigned overhead. And then let's do our auto sum to total those. So $5,720 of new cost went into job 534 during April. Again, there was beginning balances there. And then we just add those together. So I'll do an auto sum to summarize both of those. And I'll drag this down. And then I'll drag my summation formula across. So basically what this tells us is taking the beginning balances of costs that were in work in process and then adding the additional cost into work in process during the month. This is where we are at the current moment at the end of April for this job. The total cost assigned to this job is $8,220, And we can look up here and say, oh, it's not finished yet. So we're not going to transfer it to finished goods. So we can just put zeros in there if we want. Auto sum that just for completeness sake. And then we could auto sum these together, those two, just to show here that I'll drag my summation over. Look, that looks a little funny. Let's put that into better. I just did accounting format, and then you can move the decimals back because we don't really care about the decimals here. So for formatting purposes. And so now we can see ending work in process, which will become again beginning work in process at the next month for job 534 is 8,220. So that would agree to our WIP account if we were to look like at our T accounts, our ledger basically. Okay, let's do the same thing for 535. So we've got materials that were added in. We've got labor here, 535, go to the labor, 3,000. And then let's just we have this formula up here, so let's copy that, paste it down here. What that's going to do is just multiply that 80% again times the direct labor cost to give us the total. I'm also just going to highlight and copy and paste the summation formulas in here just because that's going to be the same thing. We're going to want these all to sum up. And so, you know what, we can actually do this as well. Copy and paste. Now those formulas are just adding those together and a summation there. I always like to copy formulas if I can to save time having to actually type things into Excel. So hopefully that helps you. Now we need to look and say, is this finished? Is it finished goods? FG for finished goods. And we look here and say 535, okay, it was completed. And I guess it tells us here, completed but not sold. So we do need to transfer it. And by transferring it, what we're basically saying is we want the ending WIP balance to be 0. So we're going to put negative amounts in here. That looks funny. So let's do our accounting format and then get rid of the extra decimals. And so when we do this, and now let's copy this over, which is just going to add the preliminary, and then that number, which is really just a negative of that, it's going to end up showing us that we have a 0 balance. And I'm going to do a format painter on this just so you guys can really see that. So those are zeros. I'm going to match this formatting. This is like the accounting format of zeros, which, is fine. But just for the sake of illustration and making sure you see that that's a 0, I'm going to put it like this. So basically what we're saying is job 534 is still in WIP, but job 535 was completed. And so the negatives mean we move that cost out to finished goods. So it no longer has a work in process balance of anything because it's done. It's not work in process anymore. Okay, and then let's finish this off. So 536 job was started this month, so it had no beginning work in progress balance. But in all other respects, we're just going to do the same stuff. We got materials, we got labor. We can copy that formula to multiply the direct labor cost times 80%. Then we can copy a bunch of these formulas. We can copy this in and paste it in. That one just, adding. This is kind of redundant because there's no beginning balance, but just for consistency's sake, this is what we're doing, is adding the beginning balance plus the cost incurred this month. There was no beginning balance, so those are the same thing, cost incurred this month versus beginning plus cost incurred, but that's okay. The job is not finished, so we can just kind of copy these down as zeros, and then this is going to be an ending WIP. So again, we can copy that formula. Again, a little redundant because we're just basically saying this is also ending WIP is preliminary WIP, same thing. We're not transferring any, but just again for simplicity or consistency's sake and having formulas and reports and kind of information that is clean and consistent, we can just have those same formulas for each one. So when we look at the summary sheet here down at the bottom, that kind of helps us understand, this is what our totals should show in the actual WIP account at the end of the month, is the total balance in WIP, once all is said and done, should agree to this 26,300. And in the accounting records, you would probably, you would just basically see for the work in process inventory asset account, the ending balance of 26,300. And if you wanted to know what that was made up of, Then you would drill down into this detail and you'd be able to say, oh, 26,300 of work in process. And that is made up of job 536, which has these individual costs, and job 534, which has this individual cost breakdown. So if you wanted to get more information at a granular, detailed level, you could drill in that way. We're just kind of only doing this part of it. But do understand that behind the scenes with the journal entries and, all the normal accounting type stuff, the debits and credits, we are going to be adjusting our WIP account, and it should agree to this information that we have here on our detailed reports. Okie doke. Now speaking of debits and credits, let's come down here a little bit and look at the journal entries that we need to do for the application of those materials above. And so these aren't too difficult. And let's start with the credit, actually. So let's go up, and this is applying materials, right? So again, this was all the materials that we used during the month. So we can take that total down. It was in raw materials, but we're crediting that raw materials inventory asset to reduce raw materials because we actually used these materials now. They're not raw materials anymore. They're now either WIP or overhead. And then the WIP portion is the, let's actually put the overhead portion first, because this is a little easier. We could just say the indirect materials were 800, and then we can just take the difference between those, 11,000 minus 800. That gives us 10,200 of costs for materials that we added in. A little bit easier just to back into that. Debits have to equal credits, right? So we could that's basically telling us the sum of these three things, which is 10,200. Easier to do it as a formula just by backing out the 800, which is the one indirect piece. Okay, now let's do the same thing for, where am I at? Oh, labor, here we go. Same thing for labor costs. So the total was 13,700 of new costs incurred during the month. The amount of indirect cost was 1,200. So that goes to overhead. And then the rest of the actual costs that went into WIP was 12,500. Okay. And one thing too, you can kind of see this here in the reports as well. So this is the summation of all the costs, by job. And then that's basically what we're saying as well from a journal entry perspective, is that total amount is the 10,200. And this labor total added into WIP was 12,500, which agrees to what our journal entry shows down here. And then finally, I guess we have number 4, but now with the with the overhead, we want to put this in, and here we could kind of use this number as our source, and we would basically can just say the total of all of our allocated overhead, everything times 80%, came out to 10,000. We calculated this above. So that's one way to do it, is just based off our job sheets. Another way to do it would be to take the actual direct labor costs of 12,500, multiply that by 80%. And that's the same thing as well, right? Because that's basically what we did. We just did it by individual job here and spread that out in the numbers here. I think I like that a little better, just to connect it above to this number, because that number is based off all the work we did above. So there's kind of a consistent thread through this whole work project here that you're kind of seeing, hopefully. Okay, and then the last thing we need to record as a journal entry was the fact that we moved 535 out, right? So it's not in WIP, but now it's finished goods. And we could just base that off of our detail here, and we could say negative that number, the total cost, negative 10,600, and that's getting credited from WIP. WIP is an asset, it's inventory, right? Intermediate inventory. So crediting that means it comes out of WIP, reduces WIP account, and then debiting the finished goods inventory means finished goods inventory increases. And that's where this job now sits, in finished goods, hopefully sold soon. And so that'll be our journal entries then. And then step 3 says complete the below T account for WIP. Note that the WIP ending balance should agree. So this is going to show us, just like I said, how this number here is going to agree to what we've seen in the WIP T account, right? So our beginning balance in work in process was, as it mentioned above, was 4,200. That was our beginning work in process amount. Then we had direct materials. So this is what we did up here, is 10,200. Then we had labor. That was 12,500 that went into WIP. Then we had applied overhead, which was the 10,000. And then finally, we had job 535 that was completed. So that reduced WIP because it was now done and it was no longer in work in process. And then let's just total up the the debits and credits. So we have 36,900 on the debit side, 10,600. So we subtract the bigger from the smaller. And lo and behold, we get 26,300. And if everything was right, you can see how that 26,300 now agrees to our detailed job cost sheets here, right? So if we looked in the accounting records, if we're the accountants and we don't necessarily look at the job cost sheets first, and we're kind of drilling down on this and we say, oh, okay, this could be the general ledger, not necessarily a T account, but if you remember from accounting 2, the whole ledger where it's got work in process would have its own account. You'd have like a running total and debits and credits, etc. It shows the same stuff as a T account. So you'd have the ending balance there. And if you said, hey, I'd really like to know what that means. What does the 26,300 mean in work in process? What is that reflecting? Then you could drill into the job cost sheets. And from here, you'd say, oh, I see what that means. It's all the costs that we've accumulated for job 536 and job 534. But it does not include job 535. And if you even wanted more detail to say, well, how much is direct materials, as a part of that 26,300. And this is where you could see all of the nitty gritty details that make up that total of WIP at 26,300 basically. So lots of good detail here. And then this just kind of connects it back to what the accountants are doing and the journal entries and kind of the ledger activity, which is, this is obviously important. This is how we get information into our accounting system. But all that's reflecting is the detailed information below that's being tracked in the factory, more so as like production and production cost data here. So it's very much a marriage of production, factory, tracking systems for materials and timesheets. And then we come in as the accountants and figure out how to translate all that into inventory costs and what state the inventory's in. Is it raw materials, WIP, finished goods? We're accounting for estimated overhead and all this stuff. And so, yeah, you can never get away from the debits and credits really, but this is just how we use that to reflect in our financial records what is the detail captured on those job cost sheets. So when I mentioned in the lecture video that chapter 2 is a little bit complex, this is what I was speaking about, and I don't think it's anything that's impossible or super, super, super difficult, but it is something that you really got to practice a few times and try to see the connections between everything. It just has a lot of moving parts, kind of like a puzzle. But once you get it figured out, hopefully, and you get that puzzle solved for how the flow all works, then it's kind of fun. And it's sort of just a challenge at that point to put it all together. So, all right. Well, thanks everybody. And I'll see you in the next video for problem number 6.